Hey guys, welcome to part two of my top 12 albums per decade of my life. Part one was interesting. A lot of you guys seem to enjoy that, and some good comments and interesting feedback and stuff. Part two here, which is going to cover my 20s, it's a pretty amazing uh, spread. The ink really starts to fill the page. You start to really branch out in a lot of directions, which started to happen towards the end of my teen years somewhat. But in the 20s, the doors really swung open wide, and I jumped into a lot of different things. But it was such a expansive time for me and my collection and my knowledge and being a musician. I was just diving into a lot of different sounds and eras that I found I couldn't really do it in 12 records. And so I've actually split my 20s into two parts. But I think we can get them all in this episode here. So this is the first half of my 20s. And we're going to start with a guy who I love dearly. And the guy I think I first really fell in love with in my 20s that I dove into fairly deep was the great Neil Young. And it's not easy picking one record for me from this guy, but this one here is called On the Beach. Recorded in 1974-75. It was an interesting time for Neil Young. And a lot of these artists here, they bring one specific thing to the table that's really increased how I value them. And in the case of Neil Young, it's integrity, it's sincerity. It's, I don't have the greatest voice, but I have to sing this. It's necessary, it's essential, it's important. I feel something and I need to express it. Neil was a complex guy. Ask Crosby, Stills, and Nash, ask Buffalo Springfield. Neil kind of, Cats. Neil kind of comes and goes throughout his career as he feels the need, like on a whim almost. Somewhat unreliable, I guess you could say, but he's also true to his own consciousness. And like a jazz musician, he's a tough time being dishonest. A jazz person's so directly linked to their soul that when they speak into their horn, it's hard for them to bullshit. Truth comes out. A guy like Neil Young can't sing a song he's not feeling anymore. It's just not his DNA, his integrity, his sincerity, his belief in what he's doing. It's very a huge part of why I love him. It became an ingredient that I found very essential for me to love an artist, was that it just was something that I could love somebody who might not be the most pretty or polished if the sincerity level is high enough. On the Beach is a fantastic record. The title track, I went to the radio interview, ended up alone at the microphone on the beach. It's just the somber, melancholic blues. Vampire blues is about the oil industry. It's a interesting period for Neil. He has just gone in 72 to the top with Harvest. Like, he really hit this pinnacle. He was having a stretch there, like in 72 and 69. He does Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere with Crazy Horse, the Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young record, Deja Vu, the live record, and then after the Gold Rush, and then Harvest was just this kind of pinnacle where he really kind of becomes master of the country folk rock thing that was happening. There's Harvest, which the initial vinyl on this has like an oatmeal like texture, believe it or not. This is after the Gold Rush. I think it's from 1969, 68 maybe. His first record before this is also good. Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere is great. I have probably 40 or 50 Neil Young records, and I love a lot of them. But he's kind of hit this mainstream pinnacle on Harvest. but he's not really that comfortable there. So he kind of heads for the ditch. And these were his words. He kind of headed for the ditch because the people he met there were more interesting. He said he makes this kind of live record called "Time Fades Away," which has nothing to do with the Harvest tour or the Harvest band or the Harvest album. It's this live show where he went on the road with an anonymous band and played songs that he never played or had ever performed or recorded. And so "Time Fades Away" is this weird record that is really raw and doesn't have any of the polish of Harvest whatsoever. And Reprise wasn't thrilled with it. And then he follows that up with a record called "Tonight's the Night." And "Tonight's the Night" is just a harrowing, epic, sorrow-filled record. He just lost his friend Bruce Berry, who was like a roadie with him and Crazy Horse. And he OD'd on heroin. And then Danny Whitten from Crazy Horse overdosed on heroin. And one or two other people in his circle kind of, there were some ODs happening around him in other places as well. And so he just really had this kind of drunk, melancholic, extremely bleak record called "Tonight's the Night," which is right here. I have several copies of this. And it's a record that at the time Rolling Stone lambasted, but it's since become considered a classic and one of the top 100 records of all time in a lot of those lists. Neil is just drunk and high and filled with anguish, and it's just it's so sorrow filled that at one point he's singing the melody of a Stone song. It was Ruby Tuesday maybe, and he recognizes that he borrowed the tune from. He says, "I'm singing this borrowed tune that I stole from the Rolling Stones, too wasted to write my own." You know, it's just that kind of feel throughout it, and it's got this real Southwest Bakersfield, cactus in the desert. I mean, it's dry and drunk. You know what I mean? It's dry and drunk. Just dry, starry desert nights and a lot of sadness. And Reprise refused to put it out. They would not put it out. And then so he went back in with a different group again and he records "On the Beach," which is a little less bleak and a lot less drunk, but no less sorrow-filled or melancholic. And "On the Beach" is it was one of those records actually that Neil didn't have available on CD for a long time. So a lot of Neil Young's catalog wasn't available on CD right off the bat, and it didn't become available on CD until much, much later. And of course, that's almost irrelevant at this point, CDs. But I mean, "Vampire Blues" is one of my favorite tracks on here. I love a lot of the tracks on here. "For the Turnstiles" is great. "Revolution Blues" is great. It's really a record worth checking out if you don't know it. And I love Neil. Like I said, I have most of his stuff up until probably about 2002 or 3. And there's a streak of records he does in the 90s I really loved a lot. This "Broken Arrow" record with Crazy Horse. That's a really solid effort. This "Mirror Ball" record they did with Pearl Jam. I mean, talking about the garage rock king playing with the next generation, the grunge. "Sleeps with Angels" from '94, again with Crazy Horse. A really, really solid record I love. "Ragged Glory," "Freedom." So a lot of these records where it kind of has that resurfacing in the late 80s, early 90s, into the early thousands were fantastic. And I've kind of not stayed connected the last 15 years. I know he's still doing stuff, and he's still a strong advocate for a lot of causes, but I've not kept up, sadly. But "On the Beach," absolutely important record that I listened to endlessly throughout my 20s. Love Neil Young. So the next band I really jumped into hard in my 20s, probably starts in my late teens, is the Beatles. And this is the White Album. It doesn't need much explanation. Their 1968 compilation of somewhat solo tracks in a way. By this point, they were kind of working individually much more than they were earlier. But there's just some of the best songs on this record. "Happiness is a Warm Gun," "I'm So Tired," "Dear Prudence." I mean, there's tracks on here that just mean the world to me. Paul McCartney's bass lines on a lot of those songs are so iconic and beautiful and melodic and rhythmic. His tonality is just unrivaled. He's one of those guys that when you hum a Beatles tune, you hum the bass lines, not the guitar lines. The guitar lines are much more rhythmic in a lot of Beatles tunes. It's those bass lines, do 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 on Dear Prudence. Like it's incredible. I was actually watching some YouTuber talk about McCartney's bass lines recently, and he talked about how influenced Paul McCartney was by James Jamerson, the great Motown bass player. And McCartney's bass lines in the early records are very simple, based on the root and the fifth, and very simple open whole notes and half notes. And it was the flourish and the rhythmic pulsing of those Motown records that really started to grow in popularity in 64 and 65, even in England, that young McCartney was like, oh, that's what I need to bring to my bass playing. And the difference is crazy starting in Rubber Soul 65, 66, and what he does. And I'm just a huge fan of the Beatles. They changed the direction of so many things. They were the innovators of so many things, sometimes not even by their own design. They just changed how a lot of things were done. You know, from how guitar amps were built, from how PA systems were installed. The Beatles, Beatlemania, the scale of the record industry, everything shifts dramatically because of Beatlemania and the impact of what they did. And while not the greatest musicians separately, as a whole, their parts are greater than their individual pieces. They just make great songs. And McCartney's a great songwriter. Lennon has a great deal of spirit and conviction. Their impact and influence on everything is like unanimously awarded. They're the greatest bottleneck in music history, where everything before the Beatles is in their sound. From ragtime to the blues, to gospel, to funk, to rock and roll, it's all there, you know. And then everything after the Beatles has roots of what the Beatles did and innovated. They're truly, truly one of the great bands of all time. Sgt. Pepper, Revolver, Rubber Soul. I mean, Magical Mystery Tour. Even there's a lot of Yellow Submarine. I love that movie when I was doing my LSD days. Yellow Submarine was a lot of fun watching those colors blend and blur and do their thing. I was a big fan of Yellow Submarine, the film. It's kind of weird in a Yellow Submarine, isn't it? It wasn't even voiced by them, which is one of the weird things. But White Album for me though is just as probably the one I listen to the most. You know, there's so many great songs. Year Blues, I'm So Lonely, I Want to Die. The way that song is, it's black music. If you listen to it, the guitar goes da-da-da-da, the bass is boom, boom, boom. Then the other guitar does and those things interloop as Ringo lays down the drum tracks. They all just kind of do their little piece, leaving a lot of space, and it makes those lyrics of John even more powerful when he's like, "I'm so lonely, I want to die. If I ain't dead already." You know the reason why. It's just killer stuff. So you gotta love the Beatles, and they really changed and opened my mind, Pandora's box style, to everything. So Neil Young brought that integrity and that sincerity that meant a lot to me, and the Beatles brought just a whole new openness to what music is and how to listen to music and what music can be and what makes it good, and the hooks and the message and how that all can interweave into something that's really special and unique. So the Beatles were a hugely important thing for me. And I, of course, have a massive Beatles section. I have a massive Neil Young section. What you're seeing back there, that's pretty much my classic rock stuff. There's some blues stuff at the very top, but it's pretty much my rock and roll shelf. And we're in the back lounge back here. I don't take you guys back here very often. There's another set of turntables there. This is the rock and roll shelf. And then back here is the hip hop and the funk R&B records. So there's even the record shelves illustrate the diaspora and the broadness of my collection. So after the Beatles, the next one that came along for me was the Grateful Dead. And again, it's hard to pick a Dead record. I'm going to go with American Beauty. The early Dead records are fun. The first one, Anthem of the Sun, Oxo Moxoa, and the live Dead, of course, from '69. And Pigpen, that whole era is an interesting part of their history. But I'm much more into their folky, rock, sing along era with songs like Friend of the Devil. I mean, that's the era of Dead I Love, Bertha, Don't You Come Around Here Anymore. American Beauty is one of the great classics of American classic rock and country folk crossover. Just a beautiful song. Phil Lesh sings Box of Rain, which I think is gorgeous. And you don't catch Phil singing a whole lot. Sugar Magnolia is a classic. Truckin's a classic. Friend of the Devil is a classic. Candyman. Oh, Broke Down Palace, one of my favorite songs of all time. So there's just a number of songs. Broke Down Palace is talking about his own death. You know, it's a Robert Hunter classic lyric. And the Dead just moved me, and they're so separate from the mainstream, which is part of why I love the Dead. They never sold out. They were never really part of what was happening. The charts and album sales and successful records, all of that eluded them, but fame and stardom didn't. They really went their own way the entire time, and they had the hugest successes of their career in the '80s touring when they really weren't even making records. From '80 to '87, they didn't do nothing record-wise, but they had some of the greatest grossing tours those years in the fall and spring and fall tours. This documents the '87 tour from the Built to Last album, like it is. I love Without a Net. It's got some overdubs on it, I believe, but it's one of the best sounding Dead records you'll ever hear, and probably because of part of that. But what makes this record so great to me is Brent Midland. And Midland dies not long after this, sadly. But the third keyboard player for the Dead was Brent Midland. First was Pigpen, the blues guy. Then it was Keith and Donna Godchaux, and I loved Keith. Didn't care for Donna too much. Keith's a great boogie-woogie player with a lot of style and rhythm. But Brent really has a lot of soul. Southern White Boy, Allman Brothers type soul. Brent Midland's a deep cat. And by the time they're in '87, '88, '89, he's been with the band long enough, touring long enough, that his vocals have become really strong, singing harmony to Jerry and to Bob, that thickened both Bob and Jerry's vocals up. Both Bob and Jerry aren't the greatest singers. Jerry especially needed some thickening when he was weak and when he was struggling with drugs, and Brent's voice was just a soulful, powerful, bluesy voice that really gives the band a kick in the pants because he's just so into it. You know, he's just so passionate about it, and Feels Like a Stranger, Mississippi Half Step, Uptown Toodaloo on here is one of my favorite songs of all time. Althea's crazy good. Cassidy's crazy good. Eyes of the World, of Help on the Way, Slipknot, Franklin's Tower. It's really a great live set. Other records by them I loved a lot was Skeleton and the Roses from '71, which was really should have been 2 recorded albums, but with stuff they recorded just live, they put the songs out as new material from live versions. And a lot of that stuff was staples of their set for years. Working Man's Dead came out the same year as American Beauty, and it's also got a lot of staples of their set. And their 2 masterpiece records really were American Beauty and Working Man's. And then this is The Great Europe '72 from that same era. It's a 3-record set when they were on tour in '72. I love this era. It's the end of Pigpen. He's not performing as much. He's singing some, but I love this era from '70 to '72, '73, and then I love that '80s era a lot. And the Dead has still been, more so than the Beatles and more so than Neil Young, the Dead have stayed with me. The Dead are this river of thought and consciousness and stream of sound and melody and storytelling that's got some jazz crossover for me. And I can still put Dead shows on in my car if I'm driving somewhere for a couple hours, and that Dead tape will just roll me through that whole time. And it won't ever get boring to me or stale or stagnant. And Jerry's tone, it's like a ghost whisper. He just gets into your soul. And if you love the Dead, you love the Dead. And it's never gotten old to me. It's never gotten corny to me. Bob Marley's one of the only other cats that's never over decades kind of waned out of my interest. I've always loved Bob. I've always loved the Dead. And the Dead never go too many months before I go through a little bit of a dead swing where I'll listen to them a lot for a few weeks. And especially if I get into the car doing some work, driving for a job, I'll have a number of dead CD sets in there, and I just can't get enough of them. To be honest, I still love them dearly. So probably about 93, 94, I was doing a lot of mushrooms and a lot of LSD. I listened to a lot of Pink Floyd, a lot of Grateful Dead. But the one group that really turned me on for a good 6 to 8 months was the Doors. The first and second record, especially Strange Days, for me is just, it's so fun. It's so campy mystical. You know what I mean? It's not sincere spirituality. It's more campy. But it makes it fun to party to and to dance around naked to and to ride on the crystal ship for a little while. People are strange. When the music's over, the end, break on through. Just these records are so important and were a big door opener. Pardon the pun. I listened to them a lot, partying, back in 93, 94, Waiting for the Sun, the third record, which gets lambasted a little bit. There's a couple songs in here I absolutely love. My Wild Love Went Riding. Spanish Caravan's gorgeous. I mean, it's still classic Jim. Morrison Hotel's all right. Soft Parade's got some stuff, but LA Woman was the other one that really... And this one still has footprints on the cover from where it ended up on the floor at a house party. If you can see the mud, the footprint there. We had a lot of crazy keg parties back in the day in the early 90s where we do these rent keg parties and have 6 kegs in the basement. I charge $10 for a glass. People would party for 2 days. And the doors would just be open front and back, winter time. Didn't matter. And I remember sitting in this middle of the house room, Christmas lights blinking up top, and the smoke and the weed, and doing the mushrooms and the LSD, and just being really high, having the visuals. And these cops came in, and my buddy Robbie was like, "You're not cops. You can't be cops. You're too short to be a cop." And the cop looked at him and saw how fucked up we were, but we were just dumb white kids, And they went over to the kitchen, dug through our garbage, believe it or not, and then left. So whoever they were looking for, whatever they're looking for, it wasn't us. But, and my buddy Darren's over in the other corner stuffing mushrooms in his mouth because the cops were there. So he's like, oh shit, blah, 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 eating them down. He ended up laying naked on Lyndale in front of the TC Club bar, naked on the yellow line, just in the middle of the street, laying there, 3 a.m. And Minneapolis was a different city back in 93, 94. It was hipsters, punk rockers, metalheads, immigrants. It wasn't a yuppie $2,500 apartment, 1-bedroom, studio living, BMW driving. It's different now. It's changed. Back in the day, you could be a little bit hippie rainbow gathering in 1994 on the streets of South Minneapolis. No one would give a fuck. No one gave a shit. And we threw it down, man. We would be doing LSD till 6 a.m, 7 a.m, and then we'd be sitting at the door of the bar waiting for it to open around 10 a.m. to kind of cool down and wash off our cloudiness from the night before, where we dropped our next 10 strip of LSD or another bag of mushrooms. We really threw down for a couple of years there. I realized later it was kind of a directionless point for me where my band had broken up, my childhood band, and I was kind of trying to find my new chapter. And psychedelics kind of gave me some insight, some a reprise, and also kind of a disconnect. And that it's important to remember that we don't have to be adherent to the rules of our own society. There's a grander reality and a bigger judge of who we are that's much bigger than the society we live in. Reality is all encompassing. Reality is everything that's ever been, everything that ever will be, every society that's ever been. So some of that psychedelic eye-opening mind operation where you're like, oh, I can clean the slate of the label placed on me at birth and just be the human entity that's connected to 10,000 years of history and be a bigger, broader spiritual being. It was a powerful experience that's changed my life forever. The next band that was that real eye opener was the Stones. And the Stones are so interwoven with rhythm and blues, from the Chuck Berrys and the Willie Dixons and the whole sound of, Little Richard. And I just love the Stones. Their early records are fun, up to December's Children and Between the Buttons. And then they have that transitional Satanic Majesty's Request with The Lantern and 2000 Man and 200 Letters from Home. And that's an interesting record. It doesn't equal Sgt. Pepper, but it's still a fun record. But it's really the post Satanic Majesties where the Stones hit an incredible stride, where they make 4 records consecutively that are magnus opus. Just, you could almost put them as one entity. It starts with a fantastic Beggar's Banquet, and this is the original UK cover with band toilet scene. Ridiculousness. Classic record. Let It Bleed, which is one of my favorite records of all time. And you can't always get what you want. It was one of those songs that really was a life changer for me, honestly. And I have a great story here I'm going to share real quick. This was back in 1994. I was back from living in Arizona for a year. And while I was back visiting some friends from Arizona back here in Minnesota, the FBI came in and shut down the job I was working at. It was a telemarketing thing with, it was a pyramid scheme, and they froze all the bank accounts. And so me and my buddy Greg, who was my bandmate at the time, we lost our apartment. We got evicted while I was gone, and our jobs got taken while I was gone. And a lot of the bosses got arrested. None of the underlings did, thankfully. But this guy who was running the company was buying us all kinds of band gear and monster trucks. He had this huge home in Ahwatukee, so there was trouble afoot. But I came home to visit some friends, lost my apartment, lost my job, ended up back in Minneapolis and into a whole new scene in music and hippies and kind of communal living with 12 people in an old home in South Minneapolis, where we do these kind of gatherings and people would bring potluck foods and meals. And I mean, we're talking incense and bell bond and the whole thing. Of course, I was still a long-haired metalhead in a leather jacket at the time, but it was still a wonderful community of broad, open-minded people doing drugs that was enhancing instead of the alcohol, which was destroying. And I saw that at a very young age. I haven't drank alcohol now in probably 2.5 years. I don't think I've ever really had an issue with it. My wife has an issue with it. And if for my weight and my health, I'm 50. I don't need to be drinking anymore. And I do love certain things, but sobriety's been good for me, I think. But I was going to work at this car wash in Eden Prairie, which is a good 30 miles, 25 miles south of Minneapolis. I'd ride this Metro Transit bus up on the freeway all the way out there. And when I'd come back, I'd get off on the freeway exit and walk down to the street below the lake street off the freeway, and walk to try to catch a 21 to get back to Lindale so I could get on my home over in Aldrich and go do some LSD or something. But I found this anonymous pawn, and it was this old pawn shop, and kind of in this row strip of old buildings, old 1920s kind of storefronts, brick facades and stuff. And it was this pawn shop, and there were all this hi-fi gear and guitar amps and horns and all kinds of stuff. In the back was rows and rows and rows of shelving with old vinyl records on it. And I was still kind of a newbie. I've been buying records for 3-4 years at that point. I had a fucking hockey bag full of them. And my trip to Arizona, I ended up losing a bunch because I think my friend actually pawned a bunch of them. He said they got stolen, but in retrospect, I'm pretty sure he pawned the ones that were valuable because that's what was missing. And so all my Iron Maiden vinyl got pawned away, sold off. But I did get some of it back, thankfully. But so I go in this little pawn shop, and nothing was priced. Nothing. But nothing was organized either. So you just had to go back there and start digging through the shelves and the boxes on the floor. And I would find Dead records and Stolen records and the Beatles records and the Neil Young records. And I got so much of my classic vinyl records there, my classic rock records. And I bet you I was paying 50 cents and $1 or $2 for most of that stuff, including numbered white albums with the posters and the pictures and just some really cool records, man. And going through it, I found dozens of white albums, just dozens of them. And I was so fascinated with the Beatles that I bought numerous copies of some of that stuff. I even found some British pressings of some of that Beatles stuff, which was pretty cool. I think I'm on Beatles 65 there. But it was a really cool pawn shop. And I can't see this cover for Let It Bleed or hear Can't Always Get What You Want and Not Think About. But Let It in Vain, Love in Vain, fantastic. Monkey Man, what a great riff in the piano in that. I think it's Jimmy Stewart plays the piano. Man, killer. Gimme Shelter. It's just one of the great rock records of all time. Then Sticky Fingers ups the ante even from there with like Moonlight Mile, and man, what a great record this is. Brown Sugar, Sway is one of the great songs of all time. Wild Horses. I mean, it's just You Got to Move, which is the old blues standard. It's just, I Got the Blues for You, which is these records taught me about the blues, honestly. Sister Morphine and Dead Flowers and I Got the Blues for You. Just painful stuff. It's just gorgeous, man. Sister Morphine. I mean, these records are transcending. They're powerful records. And Can't You Hear Me Knocking? I mean, just these records are so great all the way through. And Goat's Head Soup is kind of the end of that stretch. But, I mean, Coming Down Again. Coming down again. Oh, forget about it. And you don't think they're faking it. You know what they're talking about. But this is the one. Exile on Main Street. You know, I mean, you can say what you want about Let It Bleed and Sticky and Beggars. But Exile on Main Street. This is a nice repressing that came out a couple of years, probably 10, 15 years ago now, with the postcards and all that stuff. But Loving Cup, Sweet Virginia, Soul Survivors, Shine a Light. Man, Happy. Just, I love song after song after song after song on this. It's the drunkest. It's Appetite for Destruction before. It's got soul. It's got that exile, living in the south of France, all down the line. Stop Breaking Down. Soul Survivors Killer. Man, it's seriously. I love this record. Happy. Turn on the Run, Ventilator Blues, down the line, down, 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 down. Keith can play a riff. You know, and Keith teaches me about the blues and about riff and rhythm and blues. So these were so important, these records, because they taught me about space and pattern and groove, and they're borrowing from that black sound. Paul McCartney with his bass lines, the Stones with their rhythm and the Watts. It's insanely good. And the Stones don't get enough credit. Zeppelin gets all that credit for playing the blues. The Stones played the blues. Mississippi Fred McDowell and Champion Jack. They really did some great covers and did fantastic versions of them. And these were tangible records that meant a lot to me. I guess we're only going to make it this far in this episode. We're going to cut it off after this one. But the other next big leap for me was Bobby Dylan. Dylan was this huge realization for me. Epiphanal. Dylan never had been part of my initial classic rock experience. I got Beatles and Stone first, Neil Young first. You know, I was into Pink Floyd and all that stuff. Dylan was a little on the periphery for me for the first couple of years. Then I have this friend Jason who's like, dude, Dylan's a big deal. And I think it's hard for me to pick one. And it's really kind of a tie between a couple of things here. But it's hard to go against Highway 61 Revisited. Ballad of a Thin Man is just a seminal track. Buick, from a Buick 6. Always love that. Takes a lot to laugh. Takes a man train to cry. Tombstone, Rolling Stone, Highway 61, Desolation Row, Queen Jane Approximately. I mean, it's a record that it's etched in my brain. It's part of a time and an era for me that's very important. His electric era and his influence on even the Beatles, you know, to make conscious social music that had value, not just to sing nonsense, that's transformative. And his ripple effects, you know, first in folk music and then in rock music and then in country rock. He's a seminal force that's still with us, and he's a Minnesota guy, believe it or not. Bringing it all back home, another just a hugely important record for me. It's kind of equal to 61. Subterranean Homesick is his classic. Maggie's Farm, Love Mine is Zero, No Limit. Bob Dylan's 115th Dream is hilarious. Gates of Eden, Mr. Tambourine. It's All Right, Mom, Only Bleeding. One of my favorite songs of all time. It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. So yeah, I like this one pretty much as much as Highway 61. But I also am a huge fan of The Times They Are Changing. And the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan from 62 and 3. And this first one is also a nice solid record. And the fourth record, Another Side Up, has some great songs. There's a couple songs in here I like a lot. All I really want to do is be friends with you. Oh, what song is it? I Shall Be Free. I Don't Believe You. I love that song, yeah. It Ain't Me, Baby. That's a great song as well. It Ain't Me. It's it's a very counter positive message, that one. He's like, you want all this stuff, but it ain't me, babe. And you got the wrong one. But these records, The Ballads of Hattie Carroll, Boots of Spanish Leather, Restless Farewell, With God on Our Side, Only a Pawn in Their Game, When the Ship Comes In. If you don't have the early Bob Dylan bootleg series with these early outtakes from these records, there's some really good stuff on those as well. And Freewheelin', of course, with Masters of War, was one of the most important songs of all time. My metal band covered that, actually. Masters of War will really make your hair stand up on your arm. Like it's a harrowing metal lyric, and you think about it, that any metal singer would be proud to sing. I Shall Be Free. Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall, man. Girl from the Old Country, Blowing in the Wind. Yeah, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. That's another one of those songs. It's All Right, Ma. These are some of my favorite songs of all time. And they are who I am. Yeah, I mean, those records kind of define me in a lot of ways. Blonde on Blonde. Again, what a great record. Leopard Skin Pillbox Hat. I love Blonde on Blonde. It's a wonderful development in the sound of rock and roll and the content of rock and roll. Dylan opens doorways that some people say don't recognize how important he was. I even like Nashville Skyline a lot. His voice changes completely. Lay, lady, lay. It's a whole different thing, but it's still great. I like New Morning. I like Self Portrait. He does some covers on Self Portrait that are just fantastic. I've forgotten more than you'll ever know about her. It's great stuff. That's a cover. And then he does a couple things later on. Well, this is actually from 75. The fantastic Basement Tapes with the band. I'm a huge fan of the band as well. The first three records especially. But the Basement Tapes is just fantastic. Dylan was in a motorcycle accident and broke his leg. They shacked up in the Big Pink up in upstate New York, and they recorded the songs from Big Pink, the band record, and the Basement Tapes. Just great songs. Some of them resurfaced over the years. And then, I have probably 50 Bob Dylan records. I got pretty extensive collections of all of these artists. But Time Out of Mind really jumped out at me from like 94, 97. Fantastic record. I'm Sick of Love. Dirt Road Blues is great. Not Dark Yet's fantastic. Highlands. Real throwback Dylan. And he's still making great stuff. Like I have most of the stuff he's done the last 10, 15 years. That's all been pretty high level content stuff. So that's the first 5 of the my 20s. And we got 18 more to go, looks like. But they'll go quicker, so we'll cram those next ones in the next episode. I wanted to dive a little deeper into these artists because they were all so important to my development and to who I am, and also to music in general. These are all big building blocks of the foundations of the music canon. They're not just, they're not just whimsical one-offs. These are important characters that established the highways and the movements of this music. Gotta love all this stuff. All of them are worth seeking out. My name's Dan the Jazz Shepherd. Come back next time for more of what I was into in my 20s. which for those who don't know would be 1993 to 2002. So we're going to cover some more great stuff coming up. Y'all be safe. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Peace.